hard to understand as a beginning student, and then you get inducted more and more into the secrets of, of etching and all those things, and you get to be the wizard, with all of the apprentices as you're teaching it.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 76th episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Lime on Instagram and Facebook, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter with print news from around the world, all at pinecopperlime.com. We also have a Patreon page where supporters can join up at tiers starting at just $1 a month, and they all help to bring you printmaking content every week. You can also get thank yous like stickers and totes, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, you can check out the link in the show notes. It's also completely, totally, and absolutely fine if you don't want to know more about that, because the world is super weird right now, and if you just want to listen to a show about printmaking and enjoy what you hear, we want you to do just that too. Hey, print friends, we have merch. We're talking printmaking jokes, we're talking the Pine Copper Lime logo, and now, by popular demand, Shun the Non-Believers designs. Check it out now, there's a link in the show notes. One quick little note more, we're archiving PCL's past episodes on YouTube for your easy listening, closed caption viewing, and sharing it with people who are confused and suspicious about podcasts and SoundClouds and Spotifys and anything they don't really understand. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. This episode of Pine Copper Lime is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your practice since 1997. If you've been following along on Instagram, and we highly recommend that you do, you have no doubt seen their newest initiative in the print world, Speedball's Print Posse. Working with many of our close friends here at Pine Copper Lime, like Sean Star Wars and Anna Hasseltine, plus a few artists we admire like Jay Ryan of The Bird Machine, they have created a brand new line of custom inks to push your creative practice even further. So head on over to Speedball's Print Posse shop at speedballart.com to find out where you can pick up a can of your new favorite color. There's a link in the show notes. This episode is also brought to you by McLean's Printmaking Supplies. Our editor, Timothy Pauschak, just updated his tool roll actually with the Futatsu Waro Hangito 3mm carving knife. Most of us know how to go at a block with a chisel, but if you've ever seen a ukiyo-e block with your very own eyes, you know those lines come with a variety of tools, maybe most importantly, a knife. And, lucky for our editor, McLean has resources to show exactly how to hold your new tools to keep your hands and joints safe and comfortable and keep you carving for years to come. So head on over to imcleans.com to find your new favorite tool and learn something new today. Print friends, I have some great news for you. We are happy to announce that this year, the West Coast Print Fair will be hosting an online exhibition of contemporary and historical print work from workshops and galleries such as Crow's Shadow Institute for the Arts, the Maloney Printing Company, my alma mater of Davidson Galleries, and many more. This means you do not need to travel to see a wealth of incredible prints for sale. You can do it from the comfort of your home or studio, including a selection of amazing works for under $500. The event is up now through the 8th of February, so be sure to check out that link in the show notes or simply go to westcoastprintfair.com. There you will find the entire roster of printers, find new work to inspire you, and support the art of printmaking by bringing home your new favorite print. My guest this week is Emmy Lingscheit. Emmy is an accomplished lithographer known for her playful and political prints. In this episode, we talk about growing up and coming to printmaking, getting a solid foothold through the workshop and conference circuit like Frogmans, Highpoint, SGCI, or MAPC, and not to mention the magical history of lithostones. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to feel some chemistry with Emmy Lingscheit. Hi, Emmy. How's it going?
It's going well. How are you, Miranda?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. I know that you're a busy person with your instructing in your school, but it sounds like you actually maybe just came to a break.
Yes, we just triumphantly arrived at fall break without having to interrupt classes due to the pandemic, which has been kind of amazing and not at all a foregone conclusion. So yeah, fall break, and then the rest of our instruction will be online for the remainder of the semester.
Okay.
So much needed break for everybody, students included, I think.
I'm sure. Well, definitely congrats on that. So I actually know your work as you were probably one of the first contemporary printmakers whose work I really came to know, because I took over the position of director at Davidson Galleries in Seattle, and at the time I was coming sort of fresh from my master's degree in printmaking, but you don't really learn a whole lot about contemporary printmakers. Sorry, and it was a master's of art history, so I wasn't making the prints, I was studying the prints, and really wasn't introduced to hardly any of the canon of contemporary printmakers during that time. And so it feels really good 7 years later or more to be sitting down with you on the podcast and having a chat.
Yeah, agreed. I remember meeting you actually at SGC, kind of way back when. The great meeting of printmakers that has been so instrumental to sucking me into that world.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And then so for people who are listening who maybe don't know who you are, would you mind letting people know the who you are, where you are, and just describing what it is that you do kind of questions?
Sure, yeah. My name is Emmy Lingscheit, and I am currently an associate professor at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. That's in the middle, central Illinois, about 2 hours south of Chicago. And I've been here, I'm in my 7th year, I believe. But yeah, I'm an instructor and a printmaker who my work, I guess, primarily focuses on kind of the intersection of nature and human cultures, and how human structures and activities interconnect and shape the natural world in both intentional and unintentional ways, kind of how organisms shape each other through time, kind of through deep time. And so a lot of traditional printmaking, and then kind of more recently I've been getting into comics and zines in more narrative forms that include a little bit of digital drawing that is still very much through the practice and lens of a printmaker. Like all the things that I make are meant to become real artifacts in the world, because that's an important part of making to me. It's like manifesting a thing physically.
Yeah, for sure. I think that printmakers very much have the makingness in their blood, because we like having that object so much that we usually make multiples. Yeah. So you're in Illinois now, but where did you grow up, and what role did art play in that part of your life?
I grew up in western South Dakota in a town called Spearfish, and a portion of my family is still there. But, you know, it's a conservative state, was and still is. But I was fortunate to have access to a pretty good art education system, K through 12. And that's, I think, was kind of secondary to my even earlier experience of reading with my parents. They were really invested in reading, you know, children's stories to us that were really richly illustrated, really fascinating and inventive. And I think that was actually probably my first exposure to art, and also to narrative and like storytelling, which continues to be something I do in my work, whether consciously or unconsciously, kind of more consciously recently. But the storytelling aspect of that is important. Another thing that has influenced the type of art I make, I think, is we were outdoors a lot. We were really like hiking with my parents or camping. I think I spent a lot of time like laying on my stomach in the yard as a young child, just like studying a square inch of grass. And my parents also subscribed us to My Big Backyard and Ranger Rick magazine, which had these. Oh, what a great artifact of the 80s. But it introduces kids to this beautiful wildlife photography, these like really intimate, kind of up close, kind of unexpected moments with animals, and how strange the diversity of organisms is on this planet. Things that you wouldn't imagine existed being brought into your living room that you can kind of sit and page through. And so I kind of thought for a while, as you're cycling through the career options that become like manifest to you as existing in the world to choose from, I thought I wanted to be a wildlife photographer for a while there, or a scientist of various branches of science. But I was always an art kid as well. And I think part of that is I really enjoyed just the invention of drawing, that you can, put paper, pencil to paper, and just create things that you didn't even really know you were aiming for, that there's this like sense of discovery, and things that just emerge from the paper. And that's something I think that I still like in printmaking. Like that's part of the physical making. There are things that evolve unexpectedly from just the process of printing and layering and the things that you do in the studio beyond just like the premeditated image, at that point. But getting back to that question, I think that I struggled a little bit in high school to figure out if, like, at the juncture when you go to college and choose a major, I think there was some pressure where I felt like some of the adults in my life felt that maybe art was throwing away some other paths that would be more productive. And that's something I still think about. How does my art connect with the world in a way that has an effect, that I'm not just sitting alone in the studio making sort of like narcissistic images. Like I still want to have that impact and have an engagement when there are so many things going on in the world. And so ultimately, I did major in art. I went to St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. I sort of jumped ship to a blue state there and didn't go back. I majored in painting as an undergrad because that was all I knew. I wasn't aware of printmaking at all. And Jenny Schmidt was teaching there at the time.
Jenny.
And she's responsible for the original switch up. So I took a couple of printmaking classes and I really loved it. And when I graduated, I had all these connections to Minneapolis and St. Paul because I had a lot of great instructors there who are practicing artists still. And they sort of showed us a way, me and my kind of cohort of friends and fellow art students, to start engaging with the artistic community in Minneapolis and St. Paul and get involved in exhibitions and applications for some of the opportunities that are funded, because Minnesota is a good place to be an artist. They have a fair amount of grants and fellowships that are competitive that you can bid for. And I ended up kind of working. I was out of school for a few years, but during that time I made works on a little press that was actually loaned to me and my two friends that were my housemates, loaned from Jenny Schmidt. And so we had a little press and I was making tiny mezzotints and little liner cuts that I ended up applying to the Highpoint Center for Printmaking for one of their Jerome Emerging Printmaker fellowships. And that was really formative. I think up until that point, I hadn't really ever had the opportunity to take myself seriously as an artist. When you're a student, you're supposed to be responding to prompts and assignments, and you can sort of make those your own, but then to be kind of spat out on the other end of that, where you're fully responsible for owning your work from start to finish, like what medium it's in and what the themes and concepts of it are. And so I really had to start figuring that out at this fellowship, which was 9 months of access to the studios at the Highpoint for making a body of work, and also visiting critics that would talk to you about your work. And so that was great for me. And I made, I think during the course of that 9 months, I made 6 big lithographs, which was kind of a conscious choice to use the facilities to do something that I couldn't do elsewhere. Like litho was not something you can do in your kitchen. And so I wanted to get to know that medium better. And at the point that I started doing the residency at the Highpoint Center for Printmaking, my sister, another formative influence in my life, my sister Carrie Lingscheit is also a very talented printmaker, and she said to me, "Well, it seems like you're a printmaker now. You've been fully converted from painting, and now you should check out Frogmans workshops which at the time were in South Dakota." And so I got connected with assisting for 3 summers with Frogmans printmaking workshops, which was really inducted me into the printmaking cohort, which I had not really fully been aware of. This whole sort of like national rowdy clubhouse of generous mentors, generous and really accessible people that teach all across the United States who came as instructors to Frogmans, who I got to work with as an assistant and meet. And so I was out of school for a good probably 4 or 5 years, but it didn't feel like it. I think during that time I was like gathering a lot of information about where I might want to go to grad school and just how the world worked and sort of how art and academia intersect with each other a little bit. So that was really valuable. And it also plugged me into the conference circuit. That's probably about the time we may have first crossed paths too, as I started attending SGCI and MAPC and just seeing what was out there, which I had not been aware of at all until that point. And that continues to be one of the things I really love about printmaking, is the high degree of like interconnectedness and cross-pollination that happens in all of these spaces in a non-COVID time.
Yeah.
I think we'll all be excited to return to that, but it's nice that it's happening in other sort of remote and digital ways, I guess, right now.
It's definitely making us all be a bit more creative about the ways that we connect, for sure, because we do really have that incredible community that gathers and at different residencies at places like Frogmans, at places like Print Austin, of course, SGCI, which we talked about before, and getting to come together and share work and trade work. It really is, I think, one of the things that keeps people kind of lifers when it comes to printmaking. I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed where they say, well, I came for the art and I stayed for the community.
There is a kind of, I do think there is a generosity to that culture that is maybe connected to portfolio exchanges and the multiple, and also the shared workshop environment in which you're often working if you're sharing presses and spaces like that. But it almost adds up to something more where it's kind of an extended family sort of built around this discipline. That's nice.
And so, well, I know you do many different media. I think of you sort of as a lithographer when I think of Emmy. That may be because the work that I showed of yours was primarily lithography. So I've had the most sort of intimate interaction with that. But do you consider yourself, if you had to choose a title, are you Emmy Lingscheit lithographer?
It's a good question. I think I would still identify as Emmy Lingscheit printmaker primarily, but I've been more expanding into working sculpturally at times, but I think always with a little bit of the mental structures of a printmaker. I think I do have perhaps my most enduring love is for lithography because of the sort of like alchemical ancient magic of it that is kind of hard to understand as a beginning student, and then you get inducted more and more into the secrets of etching and all those things, and you get to be the wizard, with all of the apprentices as you're teaching it, which is kind of a weird, I think there's a little bit of a like endless challenge of mastery that you've never fully mastered it. There's always more to learn litho.
Yeah, for sure. I know when I would try and explain to people what it is that I do, and I always start with like woodcut because it seems like the most basic, and people maybe did potato stamps or something as kids, and then they'd be like, okay, and then you talk through that, you talk them through etching, you talk them through screen print, and then they'll be like, and can you explain lithography to me? And I'm like, just focus on understanding that first,
You're like, how much time do you have?
Exactly. Like, do you have 3 times as much the amount of time that I just spent talking about those 3 mediums with you?
Yep, totally.
Yeah.
It plays well with other media too. That's the thing that I like. I often combine it with screen print to just get more kind of immediate color and more kind of modularity to be able to mixed editions and try out different things. But I love the kind of unmediated mark of litho, that it's capable of so many things, and you can just draw directly and intuitively on the stone without having to translate marks for photo processes or for printing in a relief style, anything like that. So yeah, there's some magic to that. But I also just love a slab of limestone too. Who doesn't?
I know. I know. They're really just beautiful objects. And one of my favorite observations I've ever heard about them, I think it was when I was interviewing Elizabeth Jean Yance, and she was talking about how the stones have these personalities in this life because they're made of living things. And I just loved that idea that lithographers are just doing this dance with all of these billions, or I guess probably millions, of ancient little lives, to create something new, to create works of art on it. It's just it just doesn't really get more poetic and strange than that, which, are just
Totally.
the two best combinations, I think, for sure.
Totally. Yeah. It's like a slab of geologic time from the beginning, from when it's quarried, but also as it's been worked. A lot of the stones that I've touched in various studios over time have been, in use since the, early 1900s. So they might have like old map images or old advertising or old political posters. And it has all this kind of like history embedded in that object that I think is amazing. And actually all of those artifacts out in the world are something that those posters and kind of hand-drawn maps are things that I want my lithos to kind of reference a little bit in their hand-drawnness too. So there's all these historical legacies around litho that are kind of magical.
And so did you find that traditional, hand-drawn stone lithography during your residency at Highpoint, or were you familiar with it before that?
I did it in undergrad, actually. Yeah, it was completely out of left field. I was like, okay, we're going to draw on this rock. Now we're going to acids on this rock. We're going to roll ink in the rock. I still remember all of the anomalous disasters that happened in my class from other people rolling their stone up fully black, or things burning out. And that just there's a very like Hogwarts miscast spell kind of feeling. It's out a little bit. And I remember Jenny calmly, rolling up her sleeves and saving images from things that had seemed totally lost causes. And
yeah, and it's so, I think one of the things about lithography too is, so my husband is a lithographer, does many media, but is particularly interested in lithography. And because of that, we tend to interact with lithographers out in the world when we travel. And, you'll just find people who have stories of how different people do it. And if it's Mexico City or Paris or Bangkok, people will be doing completely different things on the stones and still getting the same beautiful results. So there's just such a strange, I think that's like maybe kind of what adds to the Hogwartsy kind of feel about it, is that it's just so many different paths to get a different result, and the way the breeze is blowing that one day and the way the humidity is in the air will affect things, and people will learn their own techniques that work that other people just can't get to work no matter what they do. There's not much in our modern world that gets to keep that bit of mystery about it, I think.
Yeah, it's true. And you're right. They're like regionally specific according to like scarcities of materials at times, and also just cultural customs within each school. Like even throughout the United States, people learn different ways, and they're not exchangeable. It is one of the things that I've kind of noticed. People would be like, well, here's a better way to do that. And I can't slot out that one specific part because it's so interconnected with all the other steps that I've learned that kind of relate to each other too. So I just feel like there's a very personal sort of recipe for each way that people do things that you can kind of absorb over time, but not quickly.
And so to move a little bit from, sort of the media or the technical process of what you make, and kind of maybe get a chance to chat a little bit about the subject matter. At the beginning, you used the phrase nature and human cultures as a way you describe what your art is about, which is just a really fascinating turn of phrase for me, because I'm someone who's, a Ranger Rick 80s baby myself, and grew up just adoring animals and still do. And that's always something that really drew me to your work, was these beautiful renderings of these animals that you find throughout what you do. Can you just talk a little bit maybe more about that phrase in particular, and kind of the way that you use this visual language to explore nature and humans interacting?
I think another word that I am sort of interested in for describing my work is post-naturalism, this idea that we are kind of permanently affecting organisms beside ourselves in ways that will kind of reverberate throughout time, and often kind of unintentionally. I think there are some kind of ideas in like object-oriented philosophies like new materialism and speculative realism that I think about in my work that are thinking about kind of materials in our bodies and materials in the bodies of other creatures and materials that are in the world that we think of as inert being all very kind of related to each other, and that we see the world through an extremely kind of biased human lens, but that all of these processes and exchanges and lives really are happening with or without humans there that we're kind of missing and also kind of obliterating by our obliviousness to them right now at a time when, there are more people on the planet than ever, and there's not very much interest in changing our economic system, which is really focused on sort of consumption and extraction from the land and the creatures around us, and constant expansion that seems really untenable. And I think we all kind of know it, but there's not very much either will or imagination to change that. And I think that my work is trying to kind of parse down and show kind of what's at stake with that, and what things are maybe being overlooked, and appreciating how our fates are intertwined, that there's this like connection between humans and the environments around us that is almost, to borrow a phrase from the author Timothy Morton, who's like writes about new ecological perspectives, that it's like an interconnected mesh. All organisms are actually kind of just like different manifestations of some of the same stuff and some of the same life forces. And I think it's easy to forget that because of just the dominant culture of and our sort of like digital lives, that everything, I feel like more than ever, things have been kind of reduced down to like, looking at screens and moving kind of units of our income around.
Oh my gosh, that's so dark and so true. Oh gosh, yeah. Emmy.
Sorry to bring it down a little bit. But it's like,
it's good.
Yeah. Going outside and staring at that square inch of grass in your yard can kind of like reorient your brain a little bit to like what is actually, the main stuff that life and the planet we're on is made out of, which will, presumably endure beyond the culture that we're kind of, the accelerating culture that we're in right now, that is like accelerating to what end, Like I'd like to believe that we're all going to be around in 200 or 300 years, but sometimes I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to wonder, actually, out there. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that square inch of grass again as a foil to the accelerating life of moving imaginary units around on a screen. Because when you were describing that childhood in Western South Dakota and doing that, it immediately brought me back to doing that as a kid as well, and just being fascinated by it, like the different kinds of blades of grass. There's the thick rough ones and the little baby new ones that are light green, and the different kinds of dirt. And when you're staring at that square inch of grass, that a worm comes through and it might be gross, and a little potato bug comes through and it might be cute, and I just would spend, I don't even know how much time doing it, but many, many hours, I'm sure, in total. And I wondered, are kids doing that anymore when they have screens now and they can play games on mom and dad's phone and that kind of thing? Is there just a fascination with just that little world beneath our feet that still happens? I don't know either way, but I think it would be a shame if they're missing out on that innate curiosity with the world that can be fostered in those moments.
Yeah, I hope. I mean, it is available to most people in some space, where, we're all living in different circumstances, more, urban or rural environments, but there are those things to be found. And that is increasingly even sort of like compromised, even if all you can find is like a little patch of grass coming up through a crack in the asphalt, like that's still nature. That's kind of what we've got to work with at this point. And you can't throw everything out just because it's no longer, a pristine forest off in the distance. That you have to encounter it where you can and kind of tune in at whatever scale you can.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to also say that my interest in organisms and the focus on our kind of like human centeredness is that it creates this view where everything around us is basically like a raw material or an ingredient for something that we want to do, some purpose that we want to forward at the cost of everything else. And I see that kind of in the place that I live here, having moved from outside into Illinois. We have a very leafy, beautiful town that I live in. But if you go beyond that, beyond all the kind of tree-covered streets here, we're surrounded by corn and soybean fields for just like miles, tens and hundreds of miles around, because it's just primo territory for that kind of monocultural crop and like in large scale industrial farming. And that is at the cost of anything that doesn't serve that overarching efficiency is eliminated. And there's a lot of money and time spent on like maximizing the crop and eliminating the pesky things that get in the way of that, be they like pocket gophers or weeds. There's all of this technology, including that our university partners with focusing on through these big ag tech companies. And that is sort of my interest in kind of ecological justice, increasingly with my work kind of more recently in a direction that I'm going in, is that ecological justice and social justice are pretty intertwined. And you're starting to see that with like climate refugee situations that'll often where industrial waste is most prolifically dumped. Those are the most impoverished and powerless communities, often like communities of color, people that are, struggle to have the resources and access to kind of advocate for themselves. And that our ideas about like the otherness of creatures besides ourselves and the few plants or animals that are useful to us, it has some parallels in like the othering of people that we feel maybe like less valuable or more expendable or disposable, and that those things are kind of converging in the 21st century in ways that have to be paid attention to. And so I'm kind of like in the past been a little more focused on just thinking about animals and plants, and now thinking more about how those translate to inequalities just between humans, and like how those intersect with these dominant ideologies that we're stuck in that we don't even really know or see around us. Like straightness and white privilege or white supremacy, and these things that are invisible if you have never questioned or examined them. So like speculative fiction and queer theory and science fiction, these are things that are kind of like interesting to my work and storytelling, I think, too.
I always am sort of fascinated by this theme, how basic goodness tends to actually affect different spheres that we've drawn these distinctions around, like environmental justice and social justice. And we think of them as different things, but actually just basic human dignity and decency in one realm will have a positive effect on many others. And it kind of leads me to have a faith, I suppose, that perhaps the world is always seeking this equality and this justice, and because that is when things are in harmony, and when even things like power or wealth distribution get so far out of whack, it sets off all systems. Because order and balance is the natural state for things to go smoothly in nature, as well as economic, social, racial justice, all of that.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is just be ethical.
Yeah, yeah.
Easier said than done, but there are some sort of Christian tenets that I think I was raised with, that whether or not one still practices those, a religion, the things that you are raised with become like mental structures in your brain,
Mm-hmm.
that are an inescapable architecture of the way you see the world. And I think that there are some sort of Judeo-Christian kind of call to maintain those, the natural world around you, and to look out for people that are weaker or need help, or like to do unto others. And I think this political moment has been extremely depressing to watch.
Mm-hmm.
The folks, some segment of the population that is ostensibly, espouses those beliefs, but is sort of willing to stand by.
Well, there's, the disturbing numbers about more white women voting for Trump this year than in 2016 is just, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, we're getting into deep territory now, but I think a lot of that has to do with heteropatriarchy, that overrides kind of it. And again, it's an invisible thing, but the desire not to cancel out your husband's vote is a profound sort of thing. And I think it kind of points to the way in which people feel unconsciously that those structures are good for them, that they're protected and fine with that status quo, but it is depressing.
And that people are somehow unqualified to report their own experience is something that I always come back to. Is, people might look around and say, well, I'm fine. Is it really that bad for these people who are saying it's that bad for them? Like, yeah. And it's just like, yes, it is. It's their lives. They know. Like, and just the fact that you can hear all of these stories of people saying and just being like, yeah, but is it though? Like, it's just like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And I feel like that is one of the powers of art or narrative, is bringing those stories that might be invisible before people that might have the power to care and affect change. I think the people that have the most power to kind of change the system are often the same people that are the most insulated against the consequences. They're protected from knowing the situations that other people are in, unless you're kind of consciously looking to seek that out or educate yourself, such as the big kind of sea change that I hope is permanent, that happened over the summer after the murder of George Floyd. Saw people reading about like being actively anti-racist in ways that they may never have engaged with before. And I think there is some goodwill, out there, and that has to be sustained. And it does require people like making an effort to get outside of their comfort zones, to know about things that don't feel like they affect them directly. But I think it's like you said, like a healthy society benefits everybody. I don't think anybody likes living in this constant state of what feels like cultural warfare in America, that we saw with like the division of how votes came down, for president. But
there's oftentimes I'll get satisfaction or just sort of happiness and talking with someone, who was raised as a straight man, and they'll be saying something, and I'll be able to be like, yes. And this is why feminism is also good for men. Like being able to to come to these moments of being like, it's like, it really is, when everyone is okay, the world is better. There's I'm sure some philosopher that says that you can judge a society on the quality of the most marginalized people in it, the quality of their lives, of the most marginalized people, and then that is the standard to which we should judge a society, not how many billionaires do you have.
Yeah, and I mean, we can do better as a nation. United States, some real areas of growth there available to us.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you're saying that, like, using that aesthetic, using kind of beauty, using a narrative, and being able to tell stories with it, and maybe perhaps a bit difficult stories. It reminds me of something I was always curious about your work, is how it is political, it's about activism, it's about social justice, but it's never felt very super heavy-handed to me. Not to throw shade on anyone's art practice, but never has that kind of undergraduate-y kind of feel where it's like, I made a woodcut of Trump on the toilet, like that kind of like, I'm just showing you immediately what I'm angry about, which, those are cathartic, and they have a play in the world, but there's always that, your work always has an extra sort of layer to it, or an extra kind of decoding or a bit of a storytelling to say what you're looking to say. Could you let us in it all kind of into that process? Like, do you create an image and then sort of later realize what you're making the image about? Or do you think about what you're feeling and what you want to make work about and then sort of start coding it consciously?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's kind of a back and forth process, and sometimes the image will kind of appear to me first, and I kind of think about what that's about as it kind of settles in and I start drawing it. But often I'm responding to a feeling or an outrage, or, sometimes a portfolio. I tend to, when I'm asked to do exchange portfolios, increasingly just agree to the ones that are topics that I want to work with already. But I guess to the broader point about not hitting people over the head with a thing, I don't think it's productive to right off the bat poke people in the eye and yell. I think it's cathartic. And I think that serves a purpose, but I don't think you're going to change anybody's mind by mocking someone or being intentionally antagonistic right off the bat. And I don't know if you're going to change anybody's mind by being subtle. It seems like the psychology is that people's minds are very hard to change. And so that's something that sometimes I'm like, what are we all even doing? I think people have to actually know somebody who is directly affected by a policy or an action in the world in order for them to become sympathetic to it in some ways. But my hope with my work is that by using a bit of a ironic hook, whereas someone is visually kind of seduced to spend more time looking at the work on the first level, then they kind of get absorbed into the second level, which is a more sort of broadly political kind of message where there's some other action happening kind of beneath the surface, some other kind of association or story that they wouldn't maybe not be receptive to, otherwise, if that was the main message kind of writ large. And so my goal with my work has always been to, speak to my fellow, artist academics, but also to your dad watching Fox News somewhere, who's like, this is a beautifully drawn art piece. And then hopefully they spend enough time, with it to kind of absorb it. Some of the more perhaps unsettling or unsettling to an established ideology content that's in it, and get people to sort of be invited to ponder those things in a more honest way than if they were just immediately sort of reacting having the reaction of, I don't agree with this. And why would I give them time kind of thing.
Yeah. The science of changing people's minds is fascinating and slightly depressing when you realize how difficult it is, once people have reached a certain age. And I think that age is, 10 or something like that.
Backlash effects are real too. If you tell somebody they're wrong, they're going to dig in.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so what I've heard about it in terms of the extent that people have actually studied it is what you've heard, is that, if someone holds a prejudice against queer people, pretty much the only known way that changes is if they meet a queer person, an out queer person, and they can say, hey, actually, did you know, I'm gay or I'm trans or whatever it is. And then that will actually plant the seed of someone looking someone in the eye and being like, oh, but I like you.
I think it's true. A lot of those prejudices are a failure of imagination, a failure of empathy, because you think you don't know anybody that it affects. That, yeah, if you can get over that, help somebody kind of embody what that would be, to be the other, I think can increase empathy.
Mm-hmm. And sort of, knowing that it's possible to maybe have a bit of a storm cloud outlook on people in the arts making work that holds these ideologies of about social justice and environmental justice. But I also always want to return to this idea of like, what else are we to do? You know,
Yeah.
like maybe it's not, maybe your one piece won't be the tipping point for someone to change their view, but maybe it will. And maybe it will because over the course of their life, they've seen 100,000 displays of this message in various forms of art, whether it's watching Schitt's Creek or reading a novel or seeing a lithograph by Emmy Lingscheit. All of these ways that art touches people in different steps throughout their life, it's got to have some cumulative effect. I have to believe that. Or maybe it sort of primes someone for when they do meet someone who is telling them in a personal way about whatever an issue is. Maybe it all kind of works together to move that needle slowly on the overarching ideologies in the U.S.
Yeah, I think you got to try.
You got to try, right? You got to try.
Yep.
You got to try. I think also something that stands out about your work is that it can be quite playful as well, which I really like. A little bit ironic sometimes, I think. And even though you're dealing with these really heavy issues as we've been talking through, there can be definitely a sense of play. Is that something you kind of consciously put in your work to drop a little spoonful of sugar in there? Or is that just kind of your natural sort of storytelling inclinations that you know that this is what makes an interesting narrative?
I think it's I enjoy, making work, and I think that some of the visual pleasure and like the pleasure of making does kind of manifest through there. But it is also that spoonful of sugar. I think it's the reward for looking for the viewer, and I like the idea that there is sort of a promise of a reward for looking longer, and that a thing could be decoded, that there's something encoded that could be decoded, and there's some playfulness there. One of the things that I'm getting more into that I think has been kind of a back burner dream for decades now, since I kind of discovered comics in like early undergrad, is working with narrative in a longer form. I think I sometimes try to pack a lot of detail and a lot of sort of like narrative encoding into one static image, and starting to draw mini comics and like little extended narratives told through pictures and a little text has been really rewarding, and something that I think has a lot of potential for that kind of storytelling and engagement and absorbing people. And it functions a little bit more like you mentioned Schitt's Creek. I do think that actually one of the biggest ways that ideas kind of bubble through culture is through the screen, like small and large, the TV shows that people watch that are kind of shape your thinking and in these alternate worlds, and that comics can do something like that too, in the way it's kind of this sequential kind of absorbing story that unfolds over time. So that's kind of where what you're talking about, I think, is possibly heading for me. It's very time consuming, but I just kind of, along with my classes since the COVID pandemic drove us home last spring, I was actually teaching a lithography class, which became immediately not something that people do.
Yeah.
After they left for spring break, and then essentially surprise, never were able to come back. And so we switched. One of the kind of curricular project switches was to make a single fold kind of extended comic zine narrative. And so I made something along with them that really kind of took off on its own and became this much more kind of extended project of kind of thinking back to a time of an intensive experience of public togetherness from pre-pandemic era that are things I think about a lot now, like treasuring the last concert that I went to, or the last time that I, was in a crowded line at a movie or something like that. Things that I never would have thought that I'd ever become nostalgic for, that now I'm very moved by.
I'm glad that you brought it back around to thinking about and talking about these zines and these comics, because when you mentioned that, I was curious about it. Because printmaking and comics, of course, have this really intertwined history. And one of the ways I've actually gotten people sort of in my role as a printmaking communicator to understand color woodblocks or color lithographs is I'll say, do you remember when you were reading your comics as a kid and sometimes you could tell that the yellow wasn't put down quite right on a page? And then they get it, then the multiple things tends to click into place. So I would love to see more printmakers diving into that. I think comic art is incredible and can be extremely moving. I feel like some of the most moving literary or narrative experiences I've had have been reading what people, define as sort of like art comics.
Yeah, there's a really there's a moving and increasing body of graphic novels that I'm actually teaching a comics and zines class through our printmaking department this semester, which has been really good for a partly remote teaching because people are drawing at home and we're reading and talking about things. But the potential in comics for things to be entirely authored by one person is something that when you're comparing it to what, movies and TV shows do is similar in the way that it uses kind of like this kind of first person story in some cases and sort of like camera angles and aesthetic devices to show these, stories and other realms. But with a graphic novel, from start to finish, it can all be from the mind of one person. And so through that, you get these kind of representations of people from more like marginalized communities or other countries or, voices that you don't hear in that kind of mainstream media. And that's one of the things I think is really cool about comics and graphic novels, especially kind of more sort of the kind of outsider art kind of versions of that are increasingly getting published and getting more voice.
Yeah, I think that's hugely significant and just another way in which accessibility to telling one story is so significant and so important, I think, not only for sort of general societal change, but also for emotional well-being. One of my favorite podcasts, among many favorite podcasts, is one called This Is Actually Happening. And it's sort of first person people telling stories about what they've experienced. And one of them was it's not even an interview. I think it's sort of clear that you've heard, the person's been asked questions, but all you hear is their narrative straight through, just their voice. And I heard one of these talks from someone who'd been a journalist in the Congo and how he would go to these villages that had just been burned, been raided, and the first thing that people would ask him when they kind of came out of where they were hiding from, and he would arrive and he said, no, like we're here, we're with journalists, we're with helpers, you're safe now, come out. The first thing that people would ask would always be like, do people know what's happening to us here?
Yeah. Before
they would ask anything about food or medical supplies, it was just, do people know about this? And that really stayed with me as a really powerful anecdote about how being heard in one's pain, there's something that is so fundamentally, it's such a fundamental need for humans to have. And so the more that the marginalized people in our world can, through Twitter or comic books or whatever platform that's possible, tell their stories, I'm hoping that need is being met and that change will be enacted because of it.
That's a powerful story. Yeah, for sure. And also it's just like, it's good for everybody to have more diversity in our just like storytelling and what's out there. I think that culture has such a like homogenizing effect on like what filters up into our consciousness, and like letting a more direct pipeline of some of those voices through, podcasts and interviews and the kind of diversity of those media that are not like Hollywood are really important and a big, a growing kind of pastime for people to, like audiences are more aware of those things to tune into them increasingly.
Well, before we sign off here, what are you looking forward to in the future? I know that that's a tricky question a bit these days because things seem very uncertain and up in the air. But what's on the horizon, kind of despite some of the interesting projects that we've already chatted about, that is going to, make your 2021?
Yeah. Well, looking forward to hopefully a more stable and sane political situation in our country. Fingers crossed for that. But I also I'll be going on sabbatical next semester, which feels still like a magical word of privilege that I'm still wrapping my head around. But it means I'll have the semester off from teaching, which would, under normal circumstances, entail traveling. I was looking forward to some residencies and things that have been productive for getting out of my routine and totally focusing on art in past. But with the pandemic, I will be probably closer to home and close to my studio here at the university, which, if classes are still primarily online, I'll probably have the place to myself and be comfortable and sprawled out and lonely in there. And I'm looking forward getting back to, I recently had done some large scale lino cuts that were meant to be printed in multiples, and then I installed a couple times, wheat pasted up into different spaces in different kind of site specific installations. And I have a project on the horizon that kind of utilizes that approach again. So I've got some stuff at home. I was kind of anticipating that our state of Illinois may go into a stay-at-home order before too long in the next couple of weeks, with the holidays coming up and COVID numbers spiking. So it sounds kind of like sci-fi dystopic to say, but I'm kind of planning to maybe be stuck at home for a little bit, generating some blocks, just doing some carving to come back in and print again when I'm able to in the shop, which is nice because I really like the physicality and like the catharsis of carving a nice piece of linoleum. I think it's time for that in my life.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Like, none of, like, leave the alchemy and the sorcery aside. There's enough uncertainty in the world right now. Like, just carve a nice piece of linoleum
and leave the screens behind. No pixels, no screens. Just listen to some podcasts like this one.
Oh, good. I did have on my list to ask you about your golden record lino, which I just adored. And I actually have an appointment to probably get a golden record tattoo myself in a couple of days here. So I am also a huge fan of the golden record. But I didn't know, since you brought up the large scale linos and I did have it on my list, do you want to actually quickly share that particular image? Because it was so great.
Yeah, that was that golden record image. I think we called it Send More Chuck Berry because Chuck Berry was one of the sounds recorded on that record. The golden record print was actually a collaboration between me and 3 or 4 students we were preparing a block for the really big printmaking, steamroller printmaking event that's been held every other year at University of Wisconsin-Manitowoc, which has been just like a really lovely experience for the students in our print club. And so that was kind of the subject matter we were kind of collaboratively decided on based on people's kind of interest in narratives of, reaching beyond, human cultures, which was the idea of the mission of the Voyager, was to bring just like greetings from human civilization to, potential other life out in the universe. And I think it was transmitting for a very long time. And I think part of the impetus of choosing that subject matter for our print was that its signal was fading and maybe had completely been lost because it was so far out in space at this point. And so that was a really fun project to work on together because we kind of drew it collaboratively. A lot of the different parts of that print were made by different people, the 3-4 different students that worked on it. And it just came together beautifully because I think that there is something about the leaf carving that kind of marries together different styles. And the block was so big that we could all, gather and work on different sections without tools. And that was really nice. Kind of a human communal cultural thing for a project through NASA that sends out human communal, cultural togetherness to the broader universe. And then, yeah, it was a nice project and a nice time printing it. I've since read, I really enjoy reading science fiction and kind of like speculative fiction books. And to listeners, I would recommend reading The Three Body Problem, which is a book by Xian Lu. I'm mispronouncing his name almost certainly, but a Chinese author who is also a scientist who believes in reality, and also strongly presented through this book that we probably shouldn't be broadcasting our location and existence
That
to other
is,
cultures.
I know. I totally have a romantic / practical relationship with the Golden Record because of that.
Yeah, that horse is out of the barn now, so I guess we'll see who intercepts it eventually. But that book was very interesting too. But yeah, I do love a large scale lino cut, and the ways in which that it can bring communities together in making and printing.
Beautiful. Well, speaking of long distance communications, where can people find you and follow your work and see what you're up to and see what you produce on sabbatical and all of that good stuff?
Oh yeah, well, my website is my name, emmylingscheit.com, and I'll be updating things there soon, I'm sure. Don't hold your breath, but it'll happen.
Yeah.
But I'm on Instagram. At my handle is mquad with 2 M's, like the letterpress mquad. Mquad on Instagram, and so I'll be posting progress and projects there as I work.
Beautiful. Well, I will put links in the show notes to both of those. And thank you so much for joining me on your Sunday morning. And It's been really nice to catch up and talk about the heavy and the fun and everything in between. And I will certainly be in touch when the podcast comes out. And yeah, it's just been great. Thank you for spending some time with me tonight, Emmy.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much. It's been nice.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week for one more special edition of PCL in collaboration with Print Austin and our good friends over at the Studio Noise podcast. I'll be interviewing Oliver Millick, one of the artists selected for Print Austin's 5x5 exhibition, juried by Delita Martin, guest of PCL episode number 43. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.